Alright, sticking with our theme of starting to learn proofs, we're going to move right into section 2.8, which is proving angle relationships. And we're going to start out a little differently. We're going to start with a theorem. And this theorem is called the congruent supplements theorem. Congruent supplements theorem. And it says that if two angles are supplementary to the same angle, then those two angles are congruent. Okay, and give you a little picture of what that looks like. Let's see, we have an angle 1 and an angle 2. And we said that angle 1 and angle 2 are supplementary. And we have, let's say there's angle 2, same angle 2, and angle 3 are supplementary. Then angle 1 and angle 3 are congruent. And that is a bad picture, and this isn't how you really write this, but I want you to have a little visual of it before we do this little proof. So our congruent supplements theorem, that's one that we want to commit to memory. It'll come back up again, we'll use it. So congruent supplements theorem. If two angles are supplementary to the same angle, then those two angles are congruent. But what we're going to do now is prove it, which is something that is a really good exercise in geometry, is to prove some of these theorems that we know. So we're going to start out with a given set of information. We're going to be given that angle 1 and angle 2 are supplementary. And we're going to have an angle 3 and angle 2 are supplementary. We're going to prove that angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. So we're proving our congruent supplements theorem. So let's start out with our proof. Remember, we do two-column proofs. So I'm going to draw my little divider here. And remember, on the left side, and so I'm going to split it up like this. So remember, on the left side, we put our statements. These are statements that we believe to be true based on facts or theorems or other things we know. And over here, we put the reason that we know those statements. All right, so statement number 1, we're going to start with our given information. And in our statements and our reasons, we're going to abbreviate things. We're going to try to make everything as efficient as possible. So we're going to say that angle 1 and angle 2 are supplementary, and angle 3 and angle 2 are supplementary. And we've got to give a reason for that. So our reason for line number 1 is that that information was given to us, right? That was what we started with. Now, number 2, our next line, we're trying to get to here. We're trying to prove this. So eventually, we need to be only working with angle 1 and angle 3. We need to get rid of the angle 2s completely. But we can't get rid of things without eliminating them through algebra. And so we're going to try to turn this angle 1 and angle 2 are supplementary into an algebraic statement. And we can do that pretty easy like this. we say the measure of angle 1 plus the measure of angle 2 equals 180 degrees. And also the measure of angle 3 plus the measure of angle 2 equals 180 degrees, right? And we can say that because way back in our notes, and I mean way back, we learned the definition of supplementary, right? The definition of supplementary says two angles that are supplementary. If two angles are supplementary, then their measures add up to 180 degrees. So that's the definition of supplementary. Remember when I told you way back you need to memorize all these definitions? This is what you're memorizing them for. So let's move on to number 3. Remember, we're trying to algebraically eliminate the 2's, the angle 2's. So when we look at this, we see that both of these statements here equal 180. So remember that I can substitute things that equal something. I can swap them out, right? So I'm going to write the measure of angle 1 plus the measure of angle 2 equals, now instead of 180, I'm going to substitute this, the measure of angle 3 plus the measure of angle 2. And the reason I can do that was my substitution, right? It's actually my substitution property of equality, but substitution is enough. Just write substitution. 4. How am I going to eliminate these, right? Well, algebra, I can subtract the measure of angle 2 from both sides. And that's going to leave me with the measure of angle 1 is equal to the measure of angle 3. The reason I was able to do that is my subtraction property of equality. And now I got one more line. I know you probably think that's done, but we have one more because it says the measures are equal, and we want to say that the angles are congruent. And remember way back when we talked about congruent versus equal, we said they pretty much mean the same thing, right? Congruent is when we're talking about the angles, and equal is when we're talking about their measurements. So we're going to take the fact that they're equal and use it to say that they're congruent, and that is because we know the definition of the word congruent. Okay, so the definition of congruent is that they have equal measures. So that's why we can go from equal to congruent. All right, so that wasn't too bad. We're going to do one more. All right, so here's another example. We're going to have some given information and a picture. So given, ray DB bisects angle ADC. And we're going to be asked to prove angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. And now I've got to produce a little picture for you here. So go ahead and make this picture yourself. Try to make it as close as you can to what I have here. All right, we're going to do some labeling. So this is going to be angle 1, angle 2, angle 3, and this is going to be point A, point B, point C, and right here where everything crosses is going to be point D. Okay, so take a minute and get that picture right. All right, so let's go ahead and start our proof. Now, we're saying that DB, that's this ray right here, DB, bisects angle ADC. So that means that this angle and this angle are congruent. Even though it doesn't say it in the picture, that's what this means. So I just added those little marks to the picture. That's not a legal part of a proof. I'm just adding them so you can visually see them. We're going to go ahead and write that out though, so that we can use that information to do something with. So first step, Well, always the first step is our given information. So ray dB bisects angle ADC. My pen's going crazy. All right, and our reason for that is pretty obvious. It was our given information. Now, number 2, and remember, we're trying to get down to say angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. So angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. If we look at our picture, you can hopefully see that angle 1 and angle 3 are vertical angles. And they're congruent to each other because vertical angles are congruent. So if you're thinking this through, you might say angle 1 is congruent to angle 3 because they're vertical angles. Right? Well, there's more to it than that, though. Okay, why are they congruent? Because they're vertical angles, and that's because of the vertical angles theorem, right? Remember that it says vertical angles are congruent. And then we also know we marked on our thing that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, and that's because of the word bisect. So that's because we know the definition of an angle bisector, or we know the definition of the word bisect. Anyway, either way you say it is fine. So we got to think of a way to put kind of this and this into this as kind of logical statements, logical things. So we'll just start with the angle 1 being congruent to angle 2. And that's because of the definition of angle bisector, or the definition of bisect. Either way you want to write it is fine. Bisect is the key word there. Now let's say that angle 1 is congruent to angle 3, and that's because of the vertical angles theorem. Now, some people argue that we need to say that angle 1 and angle 3 are vertical angles first, and we might get more specific as we go on, but for now, let's just write that down. That's good. And then number 4, now we've just said that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, and we've said that angle 1 is also congruent to angle 3. So does it make sense that we can take angle 2 and substitute it for angle 1 because they're congruent? So our last line would say angle 2 is congruent to angle 3, and the reason that is because we substituted. We substituted two things that we knew to be equal to each other or congruent. And so that's how we do an angle proof. There's that one and the one we just did for the congruent supplements theorem. And there's also something called a congruent complements theorem. Okay, it's exactly the same as the congruent supplements theorem that we did. It says that if two angles are complementary to the same angle, then those angles are congruent. Okay, so that's another one we want to stick to our memory. Congruent supplements and congruent complements. And that's it.